Welcome to the Security Accelerator podcast powered by Symbian, where each week we will discuss the latest innovations and emerging trends in generative AI for cyber defense. I am your host, Jason Kierstead. Today I'm going to be speaking with Maxime Lamothe-Brassard, who started his work in Canadian intelligence and then went on to work at CrowdStrike, Google, and was eventually part of the founding team of Chronicle Security, before eventually deciding to go out on his own and to start a company called LimaCharlie. Here is my conversation with Maxime. All right. Thank you, Maxime, for joining us today here on the Security Accelerator podcast. I'm looking forward to this conversation about MCP.
My pleasure. Very happy to be here.
So for those of our listeners who might not be aware, let's just spend a couple of minutes to level set. So what exactly is Model Context Protocol, or MCP, and what are the problems that it's designed to solve in AI?
So MCP is really designed to be, I will start by saying it's the first iteration, although I'm sure there's been other iteration, but it's the first very popular iteration of a solution to the problem of how to integrate what an LLM, commonly referred to as like AI these days, is able to integrate with other systems and query other systems and do things outside of just English, because LLMs are great at, getting language in, language out. But in the modern world, we want those to interact with all kinds of other things. And so how do we do that? Because it turns out it's a really difficult problem.
Yeah. I was talking to someone 2 weeks ago about this, and they were essentially, we were jamming about how MCP, it's almost like trying to solve the API problem for AI, because we've never been able to solve it for any other use case. I don't know if that's something you agree with or not, but it's almost like the AI companies had to create MCP because we've never been able to get our act together over the years as software developers on how to standardize REST APIs in the first place.
Well, I think that's half of the big problem, right, around the standardization for sure. But the other one is, working a lot with LLMs and integration is this realization that fundamentally an LLM, like I was saying, is language, right? Language in, language out. And API comes at no point in this, right? The best that you can get is you can kind of tell this LLM how it should write language that looks like it should call an API. And it turns out that can work fairly well, but it also breaks down in the strangest ways every now and then when the AI will decide that, it forgot a closing brace. And so it breaks the API call. And as a software engineer, you kind of think, well, it's an API call. It's JSON. It's very strict by definition. It's really well defined. But it's not when, all you are doing is just moving language around. This closing brace, right, in English, is not a big deal. So it's very odd to be working with that.
Yeah, for sure. So let's talk about this and think about it a little bit from the cybersecurity perspective. Now, we both work in cybersecurity companies, cybersecurity podcasts, so that's probably what most of the listeners are interested in. So if you're a cybersecurity analyst, like say, for example, and you're trying to understand an attack in your product, how can something like MCP change your experience for the better at a high level? Like what type of information can it help the tool surface and access?
Yeah, I think the first core concept to really integrate here is that MCP is not fundamentally, AI, is not fundamentally intelligence, right? I think sometimes people confuse that a little bit because some MCP servers expose tools that are very, very high level, right? That sound like they're doing a bunch of really intelligent processing over something. But at a fundamental level, MCP is tool calling. I'm hand wavy a little bit here because technically there's other components to that, and yes, they matter, but it gets really complicated really quickly. So it's really fundamentally, especially tool calling. And a tool call does not mean that there's any actual intelligence behind that. So as an analyst, the way to look at an MCP server is, yes, you might have, let's say you're using a tool from a vendor, you might have a vendor that offers this really high level MCP server where it's like, hey, show me where I've been hacked, right? I'm kind of saying that tongue in cheek a little bit, but sometimes, it's that high level, right? However, that's not really where the MCP servers shine. Where things start to get really interesting are when we really treat that MCP server as this interface between the intelligence and the data, right? So where you want to get to is where your AI, whichever AI you decide to use, because that's kind of one of the value of MCP. You're not forced with the specific AI. You get to say, hey, I'm looking, or the AI gets to say, hey, I'm looking for this type of data. Can you get that to me so that I can analyze it and I can reason around it? And again, I say reason a little bit hand wavy because, LLMs are not technically really reasoning, but close enough. And so by doing this, we can really enable the analyst to use their own intelligence, right? To kind of to add on top of the AI, where the analyst is able to think of new things to look at or new types of analysis, like, hey, I think this account might have done something strange in the last month. Can you go and find out all the places where it logged in and if anything was out of the ordinary? And there's a value there because the MCP server is able to provide that information to the AI, versus an MCP server that's just, where have I been hacked? Well, what can you do with that? You can only do a single thing, which is ask where you've been hacked. So that's kind of how that interface works with analysts.
So if I distill what you're saying, MCP can be the most powerful to an analyst if there are many different MCP servers all providing different types of contexts while you're investigating, and your tool being able to access, your AI-driven tool being able to access all that context as it's going and doing whatever it's doing.
That's exactly right. Now, today, there's a little bit of a limitation, or one of the problems that we have is if you give your AI too many different MCP servers or tool calls, it can kind of get lost and get confused about what it should be calling. So there's kind of a set of today concerns
Almost
or today
almost sounds like the same problem we have with analysts.
That's very true. That is very true, right? They're not, when people say, it's like an intern or like a junior analyst, it's a big overlap with humans in that sense. Absolutely.
Your company, LimaCharlie, you guys just recently launched an MCP server. So what caused you to want to do that? What was the driving force? Were your customers asking for it, or is it driven more from trying to enable what we're discussing, enable this more cohesive cybersecurity ecosystem, or a mixture of both?
So we are a little bit different in the cybersecurity ecosystem in that we are a hyperscaler for security operations, meaning we provide infrastructure, right? Security tools and infrastructure. We're not an MDR ourselves. We're not an antivirus. We're not kind of a lot of those kind of typical things that, the vendor that does it all kind of does. So when we saw that MCP servers started getting, the technology started to get a lot of traction and most importantly, standardization, which has been a huge problem in AI. Things just move so dang fast that there's a hesitation to build against a new standard, because how long is it going to be a standard? But when we saw that coming up, we kind of realized very quickly that it was a perfect fit for us because of our approach, like a cloud provider. It means we have a ton of APIs. All those APIs are publicly documented. Anybody can use those APIs. All kinds of people that are building services, but also products use us. So, 1+1 in our mind was obviously, we should have an MCP server because it's a small lift for us, and it just enables people building with a new type of tool, which is the LLM, to just keep building on top of LimaCharlie and do interesting things. So that was really the big driver for us initially to go and build that. And then we learned a ton of things along the way of what to do and what not to do.
So let's double click on that a little bit. So can you give us an example of one or two different types of learnings that you had as you're implementing this MCP server, specifically in a cybersecurity product? Is there anything that you didn't anticipate, or any gotchas that folks should be aware of when they're implementing this? I hear a lot of, there's a lot of chatter around the security implications of MCP itself, and things like RBAC and how you handle that. So, can you give us a flavor of any things that you ran into that were surprising or challenging?
Yeah. So for us, some things were not a problem. Like RBAC, as you mentioned, for us, because we had this public API, multi-tenant, role-based access control, everything. We just extended it to the MCP server. It uses the same access control that we have for API. Conceptually, it just made sense. And honestly, the MCP server uses our own API. So it just kind of all made sense. So the gotchas really, I think, are more in the category of hindsight. We should have known, but it's typical, right? You don't think of all the things, but in LLMs, context is expensive, right? When you feed an LLM the data that you give it, there's only so much in the context window that you can give it. And so some paradigms like, give me all of the telemetry from this endpoint for the last week, although technically you can do it. I can get the MCP server to hit the API and return all this data. In practice, it's kind of near useless, because it's going to be, I don't know, I'm going to make a number up, but it's going to be 100 megabytes of uncompressed JSON. This will not fit in any AI model's window. So there's no point in doing that. So it meant that, it like targeting in the stack of complexity, the right types of APIs and the right types of abstractions over those APIs was really critical. I kind of joked right early on show me where I've been hacked. That's the top of the stack. Bottom of the stack might be, give me the raw telemetry for a week. And so we realized that the sweet spot was to go higher and instead go into things like query languages around, hey, here's an MCP tool that takes an English version of what you're looking for, translates it into a query language for LimaCharlie, runs that, and gives you back the data. Because what that does is it exposes English to the LLM. And that means that any AI that you're using, that the analyst is using, doesn't necessarily have to understand exactly how to build a query for LimaCharlie, but is able to say, I'm looking for this particular account, the types of things that it was doing last week. And then on our end, on the MCP server, we kind of put all of the complex logic that needs to happen to go and put that into effect. And that was kind of the second big, not gotcha, but bigger amount of lift than we anticipated. Just mirroring our APIs, our SDK into an MCP server was easy, but not super useful. And so there's a lot of these that need to ourselves leverage AI. So we're actually using AI within our own MCP server to do some of these things. It means that in those more complex calls, like the query call, we're really calling many different things in LimaCharlie, right? We're saying, hey, for that particular tenant, what are the platforms that we've seen data for at that tenant? Okay, for those platforms, what's the schema of the data that we've observed from those platforms? and then use that to compose a query. And then we have to validate it against, our own validator to make sure that it's accurate. So there's kind of a lot of, there's still a lot of engineering that goes behind it.
That's really interesting, because it's kind of something that's not immediately obvious, that because I know that a lot of, like, let's say the open source MCP servers that I've seen around the internet, kind of quickly cobbled together. Often they're doing very little more than just exposing the already existing API. And what you're saying is, if you really want to be able to get value out of MCP and be able to leverage it with your LLM, you very often will have to put in the work it's almost like building another API tier on top to manipulate the data to make sure it works well with LLMs.
I think so, and particularly for cybersecurity, right? Because one of our age-old problems in security has been the volume of data. So I suspect things would be very different if you're building an MCP server for something like HubSpot, right? Like a CRM or something like that, where you're kind of working a lot more at the human level, right? The human scale, like, hey, how many customers do I have? For each of those customers, like, how many emails can I possibly send to that customer in a week, right? You're talking pretty small scales. But as soon as you go cybersecurity, what if you're looking at data from a firewall? How many DNS requests can I possibly get in 1 second? Turns out the answer is really, 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 really high.
So, with that in mind, right, if MCP, and it already seems like it is becoming a widely adopted standard, so it's not really so much an if, but when and how, right? As this is getting more adopted in cybersecurity, how do you see it changing the landscape over the next 1 or 2 years? Do you think that there's new possibilities for investigation and defending against threats?
Um, I think over the next couple of years, and you kind of alluded to it earlier, it's going to just become another tier. You expose an API, you expose an MCP server. I suspect that, much like APIs, you're going to have different approaches by different companies, right? Like there's companies that still today are like, hey, look at how proud we are. We expose this one endpoint to our API, right? It's like magic. It's like, okay. Whereas you have other companies that are just like, everything we do is just an API, and we happen to put a web front end on top of it. So I think you're still going to see kind of that difference in approach to MCP servers, but it will become much more of a foundation. Now, I also strongly believe MCP itself is going to evolve quite a bit. I think it's a great first-ish stab at the problem, but it's a big problem, and it's almost a big philosophical problem, right? Because of this bridging English to API and data. Like, it's not a simple thing. So I think this means that it will become much more prevalent for security analysts to be able to leverage those things. But I also believe that it may lead to entire new products that are aiming at specifically providing a layer of MCP. I think there is a ton of potential value for a company to say, we expose an MCP server, and we do this by querying MCP servers. Which, MCP in and out, right? It's kind of odd, but it's this idea that there's just still so much complexity in meshing all of these things together and making it a cohesive approach that this Meta MCP server company, I think, could do quite well.
Yeah, I mean, we've been tackling this problem in the industry for decades, this inability to exchange information. I shouldn't say inability, but difficulty exchanging information, the fact that APIs are not enough, difficulty in agreeing on ways to standardize data. So it's definitely going to be interesting to see how this unfolds. One of the advantages I see with MCP and some of this new paradigm shifting is that with LLMs, the data schema it becomes a little bit less important because of the ability to understand that natural language, right? So the need to normalize everything to the exact same schema is at least lessened to quite an extent when you're doing things with MCP. At least that's been my experience. Yeah.
No, I think you're totally correct, and that extends in other novel ways, like the concept of a detection rule. We there's how many different standards in the industry. A few years back, we could have said, there is a really critical need for, I mean, that's where Sigma came from, right? We need one way of describing a query across all these different systems. And I think that is going to, I mean, there's still going to be, a good benefits to that, but I think the importance of it is going to be greatly reduced because we will just be able to just treat a query as a query, regardless of the language that it's in, and AI can kind of translate it pretty trivially, and we can go that way. Certainly, that's how we've started the evolution on our side. We have a Sigma compatibility like engine to, take Sigma and convert that to LimaCharlie. But these days, we've not moved. We still support Sigma, but the focus has been, no, let's just look at finding the most queries that are out there from different sources and making it trivial for our customers to just go and say, oh yeah, I want that. And I want this logic, and then have that conversion done into LimaCharlie, and then to just, go.
You touched on something a couple of minutes ago. I just want to circle back on, and that's about the idea of a MCP mesh and meshing in general in cybersecurity. One of the things I've been thinking about lately is discovery of MCP servers, and right now it's all kind of manual, right? Do you think that, or have you heard of anyone talking about, discovering mechanisms for your LLM to be able to go and find out what MCP resources exist in your company, as opposed to having to go and set all this up yourself?
Things move so fast. I am sure that there is a thing out there for this. And I think you scoped it properly, meaning you said like within my company. And the reason I think this is super critical is because one of the fundamental problems we have with MCP today, which is really linked to a fundamental problem of LLMs, is the security aspect to it, right? You can convince an LLM to go and do crazy things. And I say convince in the most human possible way that you could mean it. And so if you have this idea of a malicious MCP server, that MCP server could go and do malicious things. So until we really solve that problem, and that's a really, really big problem, I think we will have a lot of difficulty with this idea of, oh, I want, a global discovery, right? Hey, I just want to connect into my Gmail, or, like all kinds of random things like that because of the security problem. So I think that's where those meshes could come into play, because they are, then it becomes a relationship problem in a way, right? Like, do I trust that vendor of that mesh that they've done the validation of the MCP servers that they manage versus, well, I found this MCP server and some GitHub repo and it said it was really cool, which is problematic.
Well, Maxime, I want to thank you again for taking the time out to talk to us here today on Security Accelerator. It's certainly going to be really interesting to see how this unfolds over the next 18 months and beyond. Hopefully we can leverage this new technology to not repeat some of the same mistakes we've been making for the past 10, 20 years on inability to share data and collaborate.
Absolutely. My pleasure. Great chat.
Thanks a lot. This has been the Security Accelerator podcast powered by Symbian. For more information on generative AI for cyber defense, visit us in our Slack community. You can find the link on our website at symbian.ai. Until next time, stay curious and stay safe.